This is the war in Russia through the eyes of Otto Carius, one of Germany's most distinguished tank commanders. He is taking up new defensive positions. Let's begin. We were happy after we had finally reached Narva. The new position was supposed to be well fortified and strong enough to hold up the Russians. But first, we needed a long time to find our support trains. There were no quarters because all the areas around Narva were overfilled with retreating troops. We therefore looked for a place to stay with other units in order to warm up a little bit. In the meantime, I set out to find the men of the two disabled tanks. They apparently had also already arrived in Narva. Prepared for any eventuality, I carried 2 canisters of good pea soup with me. I imagined them standing around somewhere, freezing and hungry. Because all of the traffic was flowing against us, getting through to the east was very difficult. We found both of our tanks without any problems at the train station, but none of the people. We literally had to go searching from house to house. And then I didn't believe my eyes. My hungry and freezing men sat at a table set up as if in peacetime. They were eating cutlets and other tasty morsels, and were being served to no end by the lady of the house. My arrival with the cold peas was greeted with a hello, and of course I did not hesitate to partake of the better meal. It was understandable that one desired a long period of rest and a decent bed. The most heartfelt wish was sleep. 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 As usual, things happened quite differently. We headed west to our unit on the Rollbahn. It had already become dark, and we had about 20 kilometers behind us when it was suddenly announced, "Everyone pull over to the right, oncoming traffic." We stopped and recognized a Tiger, which was passing the oncoming traffic only with great difficulty. When I stopped it, Oberfeldwebel Sveti climbed out and gave me the good news. I didn't need to drive back to the trains. He had brought the remainder of the company, and I could mount up immediately. We then proceeded east with our 4 Tigers. Bed and sleep were but a pleasant short dream. Zweti didn't know any details about our mission, just that we were supposed to report to the commander of the SS division that had to hold the bridgehead at Narva. We tortured ourselves with thoughts all the way to Narva and drove over the bridge built by our engineers. Excitement was in the air everywhere. In the city we only saw SS vehicles driving back and forth. It was not easy to find the division command post because the men of the SS Panzer Grenadier Division, Nordland, had mostly come from Nordic countries and barely understood German, but they were practically all strapping, energetic young soldiers. Their commander was SS Brigade Führer Fritz von Schultz, whom I immediately dubbed Old Fritz. I finally found him in a unique type of command post, a bus. It was parked next to a house. It was the only divisional command post I saw during the war that was closer to the front than the regimental command posts. I reported to the operations officer, who was located in a second bus. Rank, grade, troop unit, the usual, wishes to see the Herr General. The Hauptsturmführer then observed me with the interest one would devote to a creature from another planet. "The Herr General," he finally said, stretching each syllable. "The Herr General. We don't have that here. You are with the Waffen-SS in case you already don't know that, and we don't have either a Herr or a General. There is probably a Brigade Führer here without the Herr, if you would like to see him. In addition, the title of Herr also disappears from all other rank titles, up to and including the Reichsführer." I wasn't prepared for this type of reception, but immediately switched gears. "I would like to report to your Brigade Führer." The operations officer nodded. "That already sounds better," he said in a somewhat condescending tone. "Wenger, go and ask the Brigade Führer whether he has time for Herr Lieutenant Carius from the Tigers." He felt compelled to stress the word Herr in front of my rank quite distinctly. In the meantime, an Untersturmführer had stood up from his workplace and disappeared with a right-away Hauptsturmführer. Shortly later, he appeared again. "The Brigade Führer is expecting you." I then went into the other bus and was completely surprised after everything that had preceded this when I met a man who was the personification of sweetness and light. In my entire time at the front, I rarely encountered another divisional commander I could compare with our old Fritz. He identified completely with his troops, and his people deified him. He was always there and available to anyone. During our work together, he treated me as a son. It therefore hit all of us hard when we later discovered at Duneberg that our old Fritz had been killed in the Narva sector. The Swords to the Knight's Cross had been awarded to him in August 1944, but what did that mean to those of us who had truly lost a frontline father? When I reported to old Fritz on the bus, he immediately patted me on the shoulder in a friendly manner. "Well then, why don't we drink a schnapps to our future work together?" he said. He poured 2 cups full and clinked glasses with me. "Where do you come from?" After my answer, our conversation continued into personal and family-type matters, during which I also described my initial impression of his troops. When I got to the part about my reception by the operations officer, he laughed. "Yeah, that's the way it is here," he then said. At first, I also had to reorient myself somewhat when I transferred from the army. In the process, I had very mixed feelings, but now I wouldn't get rid of these guys under any circumstances. These men in the Waffen-SS are really fantastic and have comradeship, such as you'll probably never see anywhere else. But be that as it may, and also for your own personal orientation, I like to hear it when someone addresses me as Herr General. Whenever you come from the old school such as I do, then such things somehow seem more natural to you. We then spoke about the situation. In the process, it was shown that my skepticism about the legendary Panther line had only been all too well justified. Old Fritz explained to me, "You see, if you want to be exact about it, this entire line exists only on paper. At this time of year, of course, it is completely impossible for our comrades in the front line to dig in. There are still probably a few bunkers around from the time of our advance, but they are usually not located exactly where you could use them. Besides, the Russians have advanced more quickly than anticipated. In addition to all of that, our troops have already got so used to continuous withdrawal that they have already passed the lines to be held. When we then wanted to occupy the front line of the bridgehead indicated on the map, we discovered that Ivan was already sitting in it. I then set up a new bridgehead line. It will be your mission to help the men up front in reaching the best positions for their sectors. They then have to be fortified and held. Since the Russians only have weak advance guard forces in the area, it shouldn't be all too difficult to push them back, thus enabling my men to fortify their front line. My mission was thus clearly outlined. In its execution, the SS men and I were supported by the artillery that we had brought back from Leningrad. Without this support, the Narva front could never have held out for months. Our tanks were near the division command post east of the Narva. From the south, the front ran up to the edge of the city on the eastern side of the Narva. There, after a short distance, it jumped over to the west bank of the river, where it formed the front line until it emptied into the Baltic. The relatively quiet times were soon gone. The Russians employed increasingly stronger forces against our bridgehead. Soon they had brought up heavy and super-heavy artillery and put on a wild display of fireworks over the city. Thanks to the brave defense of the SS men, they were not successful in making inroads into the bridgehead. Only the bridge caused me worries. The Russians had it under constant artillery fire. After the railway bridge had been eliminated, it was the last crossing over the Narva. In case of its destruction, we would have sat in a trap with our tanks and would not have been able to be used in other threatened sectors of the front. I described the situation to old Fritz. He agreed with me to place my tanks on the west bank of the Narva, on the other side of the bridge. In an emergency, we could always be in position in a few minutes. I then drove back over the bridge. I was taking a look around for a suitable assembly area for my vehicles when a Kubel with a corps flag roared up from the front. It immediately stopped, and I didn't believe my eyes when Feldmarschall Model jumped out. The High Command had ordered him, as it always did in hopeless situations, to the northern front to restore order. I made the required report, and then a storm broke over me, the likes of which one will rarely see. Model's eyebrows were twitching. I had seen this before on the Central Front. I wasn't allowed an explanation or any answer at all. I mounted up with my people and was on the other side of the Narva in a flash. The Feldmarschall had given me an order that I will never forget. I am holding you personally responsible that no Russian tank breaks through. None of your Tigers may be lost due to enemy fire. We need every barrel here. With regard to himself, Feldmarschall Model allowed no compromise and was ruthless, but he was indulgent to the men in the front lines who adored him. He demanded nothing for himself. In the Ruhr Pocket in 1945, I once heard a characteristic answer from him: "The day has 24 hours. Add the night to that, and you'll probably get through with your work." Unfortunately, our guest performance with the SS Division Nordland was soon over. We continued to cover the sector for a few days until the SS men had taken root in their new positions. In the process, we were able to liberate them from 4 Russian anti-tank guns. I'll never forget the magnificent men of the Nordland Division. They fought like lions. They were better acquainted with Bolshevism through personal experience than many people of the Western world with their thick books. I discovered later that many members of the Courland Army had got to Sweden under the most trying of circumstances, in the belief that this would save them. Among them were also men of the three-ired SS Panzer Corps. They were then interned but later handed over to the Russians under Allied pressure. When one considers that even back then the relationship between the Western powers and the Soviets wasn't the best, and that people in the West knew very well what kind of fate awaited the people who came from the Baltic states, then the decision of the Swedish government becomes even more ignominious, the decision of a country in which the people like to talk so much and so gladly about the Red Cross. The Estonians, Lithuanians, and Latvians of the SS went to a certain death, or at least to Siberia, just like their parents and grandparents before them. Shocking reports are available of the scenes that took place in the Swedish internment camps when the transfer to the Russians became known. Suicide and self-mutilation are a terrible indictment against a so-called host country, men who had only taken up arms against Bolshevism to preserve their homeland, Western civilization, and as part of that, Sweden, were delivered to certain death. Our new assignments awaited us between Narva and the mouth of the river. The Russians were shifting the main points of their attacks there after they had suffered a setback at the Narva bridgehead. They were trying to penetrate across the frozen Narva and form a bridgehead on the western bank of the river. The focal point of the attacks was the village of Rigi, located on the western bank of the river halfway between Narva and the Baltic. Wengler's long-suffering infantrymen were there. They benefited from an old trench left over from the advance in 1941. On February 16th, I was sent to Oberst Wengler with 2 tanks to support his people in their defense against the massed attacks of the Russians over the Narva. Wengler's command post was located about 2 kilometers behind the front lines, separated from them by marshy woods. The colonel greeted me with outstretched arms. "Well, here you are again. I'm really happy that it was you that they sent to me, since we're already on the same wavelength. The situation is pretty serious here, but you already know that. Unfortunately, I suffered quite a few casualties in the course of the fighting during the retreat. The combat strength of my regiment on a good day consists of that of a battalion at the most. For the sector I have to hold, I really need at least an entire regiment, if not more. For that reason, the front is only thinly held. I've attempted to help myself by constructing it as a series of strong points. It's best that we take a personal look at the situation for ourselves as soon as possible. You'll gain a better impression than if I show you the whole mess on the map." We immediately took off for an orientation. Such an orientation helped us find our way around at night as well. The level of combat activity was quite high. When we arrived at the battalion command post, Wengler was told about another Russian penetration. The Russians had suffered terrific losses during their attacks, as there was no cover at all while crossing over the ice of the Narva. But even if only a small group was successful in establishing itself on our side of the Narva, they stuck to our trench system like leeches and had to be wiped out in immediate counterattacks before the next attack rolled. It was clear to see that the Russians wanted to reach their objective there at all costs and without regard to casualties. We had to support the infantrymen in rolling up the occupied portions of the trenches. That required a great deal of precision while shooting, so our own people didn't fall victim to our fire. We had to approach to within about 50 meters of the trenches, which ran in the normal zigzag pattern. From there, we observed the advance of our own people. Whenever they took a section, the first man waved. We then shot up the next 10 to 20 meter section with our 88mm of cannons until it was ready for assault. As soon as our soldiers' helmets appeared over the edge of the trench, we stopped our fire and our men took the trench. Our teamwork functioned magnificently. The Russians were not able to chalk up a success despite their heavy casualties, but they also reacted immediately to the appearance of our tanks with artillery. They sent over quite a few very pleasant greetings to us. The eastern bank of the Narva climbed quite steeply, and the edge of a large forested area extended along the high ground. From the woodline, Ivan was able to see quite well into our positions. We thus stuck out like a sore thumb for their artillery, which gave us many problems. As soon as we left our little bit of woods, it didn't take more than 3 minutes before we saw the first muzzle flashes on the far bank. Only by driving evasively all the time were we able to avoid a direct hit. I concentrated exclusively on the far bank, while Zveti supported the infantry with his vehicle. Although I silenced a few Russian pieces during every encounter, we were once again under fire whenever we reappeared. During one such occasion, I finally taught Lustig, one of the drivers, to dampen his innate daredevil attitude. Normally, this bundle of energy only drove me when my vehicle was disabled, but his tank commander had often told me that he was a wild man who always charged to the front and could hardly be convinced to back up. Certainly a praiseworthy, if also dangerous characteristic. Lustig was a blacksmith by trade, a guy built like a fire plug. Once, when a lit cigar stump had fallen between his shirt and his skin, instead of opening up the different layers of clothing that we wore in winter and taking it out, he simply extinguished it on his bare skin from the outside. When he shook hands with me, I felt like a horse had kicked me. That was our man Lustig, a man whose heart was in the right place. He always drove to the front and was unstoppable in front of the enemy. But one day, as I said, he also learned to control his impetuosity. We were about 500 meters in front of our little woods when the Russians opened fire. The first salvo landed too short, the second behind us. I didn't want to wait for the third, since we could then count on a hit. I called out to Lustig, "Back up," but he didn't react. So we stayed there, and the Russians fired off their third salvo. The impacting rounds began to land all around us, and a 28mm Colossus landed directly in front of us on the trail. It didn't explode. Like a large mouse, it skittered along as a dud toward us. It slid along the snow underneath our vehicle. We were later able to see it in front of the woods on our move back. After this incident, even our friend Lustig was convinced there was no more time to be lost whenever I gave him the command to back up. Again and again, we admired the quality of the steel on our tanks. It was hard without being brittle. Despite its hardness, it was also elastic. If an AT round didn't hit the armor dead on, it slid off on its side and left behind a gouge as if you had run your finger over a soft piece of butter. At night, we couldn't help our long-suffering comrades very much. We would have endangered them by shooting. We just fired up the ice-covered surface of the Narva whenever a new Russian attack started. By doing that, we could steal some of Ivan's thunder. They often attempted to cross as many as a dozen times during the night. They even employed sleds. Despite their enormous casualties, they wanted to force the river. Whenever they did it, we called it stubbornness. Of course, when we did it, it was bravery. We were forced to become thoroughly familiar with the reversed application of such terms after the war. The soldier who had performed his duty for his country to the very end was suddenly a militarist and a warmonger, in short, an evil Nazi. After it had finally become somewhat quieter in the Rigi sector, we received new marching orders. I took leave of Oberst Wengler, and as we wished one another continued good luck, he hesitantly revealed to me that he probably had the hardest and longest battle of his life in front of him. He intended to get married. The occasion that allowed his wedding was the awarding of the oak leaves to the Knight's Cross, for which he was returning to Germany. He was the 404th soldier to receive this high award. Unfortunately, his young marriage came to an all too early end. Wengler was killed as a general major in 1945 in the West, after he had been awarded the swords to his Knight's Cross. He was the 123rd soldier of the Wehrmacht to receive it. This concludes the 7th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.